The talk today is effects of wolf mortality on livestock depredations. Hey, but I just want to be clear on something. Now, some of you are familiar that, the college bag and myself and my team are doing research on non-lethal interventions, and that's the state-funded mandate that we have. And so the results that I'm presenting to you today haven't been funded by those funds. Okay, the state legislature didn't do this. This research was funded by Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife and Washington State University. Okay, so I just want to be clear on that. So lethal things are done internally. Non-lethal investigations are done with the state legislative appropriated funds. Okay, so let's see. How did we do this? The idea is, in Montana, Wyoming, and Idaho, we think that, okay, lethal control will result in reduced livestock depredations, both immediately and in the next year, right? So we go ahead and remove these wolves, and that will cause reduced livestock depredations over the short and long term. And then some of the questions are, well, how effective is that? We've been proceeding on that basis for many, many years, but no one's really looked at it to see how effective lethal removal is on livestock depredations. Some people have found that breeding pairs tend to be more associated with livestock depredations than lone wolves because, they're bound to the den site. If there are elk in an area and the elk migrate, seasonal migration, then there's no elk. Okay, what are you going to eat? Well, you're going to eat whatever's there, right, if it's sheep or cows or something. So breeding pairs may be more closely associated with livestock depredations than lone wolves. Fractured pack structure, perhaps you have compensatory effects. In other species, Gail Collins and myself and Trev's, we found that increased black bear mortality resulted in greater black bear human conflicts, depredations on trees and stuff like that. In my case, we found that, killing male bears resulted in females stripping more trees. In other words, their habitat shifted to crappier food to avoid these males. And more recently, Peebles and we found that killing of cougars to reduce livestock depredations increased livestock depredations the following year by about 150% because of social disruption of cougars. Again, you remove a resident cougar that may or may not have been causing trouble, and you get an immigration response, and now you got 3 subadult male cougars in the area like a stack of pancakes, and all of a sudden you got more livestock depredations. So we decided, well, let's look more closely at the effects of lethal removal on livestock depredation in wolves. Okay, the data from this was a 25-year time series taken from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. We looked at the number of livestock in each state in the wolf-occupied zone of each state, the number of livestock depredated, the wolf population estimate, the number of breeding pairs, the number of wolves killed, and also the cattle and sheep counts were from the National Agricultural Statistics Service, okay? So we obtained all these data for the 3 different states for the wolf-occupied area for each year for each state, okay, over a 25-year time series. So we analyzed this data. We looked at, well, what are the effects of removals in year 1, and we tried to get cause and effect rather than just some type of association, because maybe, look, if you get livestock depredations, you kill wolves, right? Or if you kill wolves, maybe you don't get livestock depredations. The 2 are confounded, so we did a 1-year time step. We said, what happens if you kill wolves in year 1 in livestock depredations in year 2, right? So killing wolves should result in fewer wolves and fewer depredations the following year, right? So this is an arrow of time effect. We used forward selection, binomial analysis, because the data is kind of all over the place. It's not a nice, you know, mean and all that. The variance exceeds the mean, if any of you know what that's all about. The dependent variables that we used were the number of sheep depredated the following year and the number of cattle depredated the following year. The independent variables are, of course, the first one we always used was number of wolves, because more wolves is highly likely to mean lots of depredations, right, the following year. Number of breeding pairs, because there's indications that breeding pairs may be more responsible for cattle depredations than singletons. We also looked at the number of wolves killed, and then the number of sheep and the number of cattle, because more sheep, more cattle means more potential depredations that following year. This is a correlation coefficient of the different variables. I just want to point out that, you know, breeding pairs and number of wolves are very highly correlated. Minimum wolf population and breeding pairs is 96% correlation coefficient. So we're kind of looking at the same variable there, okay? Anyway, so we ran all these forward selection models, starting with number of wolves and all that kind of thing, to see what are the effects. And for cattle depredated, you could see that the estimated coefficient is, yeah, the more cattle there are, the more likely you are to have a cattle depredation. The number of breeding pairs was more important in cattle than the number of wolves. Because again, we think that breeding pairs are more likely to, if you ever looked at a cow calf in August, it's a pretty darn big animal, so maybe that's a factor there. But a number of breeding pairs, of course, it's about 8%. We get an 8% increase in livestock depredations with each additional breeding pair. The surprising result of this analysis is that for each wolf killed, you increase the chances of livestock depredations by 5% the following year. 5% for one wolf removed actually increases or is associated with increased livestock depredation. If you take out 20 wolves, that's a 100% increase. If you take out 60, that's a 300% increase. So that's kind of holy smokes. That it goes against what we normally think. But it does make sense if you look at the next coefficient. This is our interaction effect. We find that as the number of wolves killed relative to wolf population size goes up, depredations go down. In other words, there's a threshold. Once you start killing more and more wolves relative to the total number of wolves, of course, depredations go down. In other words, when you cause the wolf population to decline, depredations go down. The rate ratios are, again, that's the number to look at. That's 8% increase or a 5% increase. Again, so surprising fact, killing wolves results in a 5% increase in the number of cattle depredations the following year. You know, what is this one? Oh, it's just another model. Okay, we ran a whole bunch of models, right? AIC models, you try this model, you try that model, like 55 different models. No matter how you ran the data, the results are always the same, right? Increasing wolf kills is associated with increased cattle depredations the following year, no matter how you slice and dice the data. We went through this data for a year. I mean, we analyzed it like I never analyzed a data set in my life, because I knew the initial results would be controversial. Here's a graph that shows an interesting fact. This is wolves killed versus cattle depredated. And you could see that as the number of wolves killed go up, the number of cattle depredated go up the following year until it asymptotes, right? So we do have an asymptotic response. That's that negative interaction that I was talking about earlier. Once you start killing large numbers of wolves relative to the population, you finally get a decrease in cattle depredation. This is breeding pairs versus cattle depredation, and the fit of the line is a little bit better there because there was a closer association between breeding pairs rather than, or just total number of breeding pairs, of course, results in more cattle being killed the next year. Now this is the most interesting graph in this analysis. It's a quadratic curve. It shows both the main effect of increased livestock depredations following lethal removal, and then finally decreasing livestock depredations following high lethal removal of wolves. Depredations initially go up, then they go down once you start killing more than about 25% of the wolf population. That's the intrinsic growth rate of wolves on average, right? Wolf populations usually grow at about 25%. So if you're killing more than 25%, that population can't replace that, right? So that's why the depredations go down. In other words, we're causing the population to decrease, the wolf population to decrease, okay? And you're overcoming any compensatory reproduction, any compensatory effects, okay? Hopefully that's clear. So we get this increase in livestock depredations, and then if you really hammer the wolves and you kill more than 25% of them per year, you will get a decrease in depredations the following year. But you really have to take them out. I mean, you've got to cause population decline. The same thing occurs with sheep. I'm not going to spend as much time on this. Ideally, we would be looking at just instances of sheep depredations rather than individual sheep killed. But we didn't have that data from the database. It was just numbers of sheep killed. We have the data now, and we'll be looking at this later, but it's a bit messier because when wolves kill sheep, they tend to kill more than one, whereas when they kill cattle, they tend to kill just one. So it would be nicer if the dependent variable here was depredation events rather than sheep killed. But nonetheless, the results are the same as with cattle. With wolves killed, in this case, for each wolf killed on the landscape, the number of sheep increases by 4% depredated the next year. And in this case, it's the number of wolves rather than breeding pairs, and it could be because all you need is a single wolf to kill a sheep rather than, more than one, like a big heifer or a calf or something like that. The graph pretty much remains the same as before. With increasing numbers of wolves killed, you have increasing number of sheep depredations the following year, but it becomes asymptotic. There's the relationship between the total number of wolves and the total number of sheep depredated the subsequent year. And that nice quadratic curve that we saw with cattle reoccurs with sheep. So you get an initial increase in livestock depredations. Unless you start harvesting the wolves at greater than 25%, then you have a decrease in sheep depredations the following year. So initially what we thought, and what everyone thought, doesn't seem to fit the data very well, that going ahead and removing wolves, either in a remedial manner, or perhaps more importantly, in a preventative manner, does not result in decreased livestock depredations the subsequent year. It is actually associated with increased livestock depredations the following year. Now, this is a large-scale study, and so maybe, a lot of people have looked at this going, how can this be? And it's because it's a large-scale study. You might think, well, how can removing wolves result in increased livestock depredations? And we haven't looked at that yet. All we know is, the exact causal mechanism. But we do know that wolves show compensatory effects, like many other animals. If you kill some, maybe you get more breeding pair. We did see increased breeding pairs following removal of wolves in this data set. I just didn't report it here. But a lot of other researchers have found density-dependent compensatory effects until, of course, you kill them at greater than the intrinsic growth rate, and then you counteract or negate those compensatory effects. Now, that's in the large scale. Remember, this study was done for the wolf-occupied zone in each year in each state, right? So we did it for Idaho, we did it for Montana, we did it for Wyoming, and we did it for all of it combined. But it's still large. Some other folks have indicated that lethal interventions work when they're looking at a grazing allotment or an individual pack. And of course that makes sense, and we agree with that. If you kill the depredating wolves in a pack, that pack is no longer going to be depredating any wolves because they're gone, right? Or if you eliminate the wolves out of a grazing allotment, of course you're not going to have increased depredations in the allotment if there are no wolves remaining in that allotment. But what we're looking at is a larger scale thing. You might want to think of this as something like whack-a-mole, if you're familiar with that game. You whack one mole, and you look, oh, the mole is gone. If you have a wider vision, you whack the mole and you go, oh my goodness, 3 other moles just popped up. And what we think may be happening is that we may have a whack-a-mole situation with wolves. Basically, you're reducing depredations on the one grazing allotment, only to increase depredations on adjacent allotments in following years. So it could be that this lethal control is indeed effective for local, temporary reductions, but it doesn't appear to be very effective as a long-term solution over a wider scale unless the wolf population is actually killed at a rate higher than the intrinsic growth rate of the wolves, and you cause a population decline. So, summary, kind of. Yeah, it's the number of breeding pairs, the number of wolves are associated with livestock depredations, but the number of wolves killed is also associated with increased livestock depredations, which is the surprising finding here. Why? It makes sense if you think about the compensatory growth and the 25% intrinsic growth rate of wolves. So below this 25%, we may have social disruption, compensatory effects, increased depredations in adjacent areas. It's speculative right now. I've got the data sets from all those 3 states, and we will now be looking at them in finer scales and trying to determine exact causal mechanisms. Bottom line is, what is an acceptable mortality rate? Yeah, we can reduce depredations if we harvest wolves at greater than 25% intrinsic growth rate, but that will cause population decline. If you do that over year after year, you're going to relist the wolves. So, yeah, go ahead, shoot the wolves at greater than 25% and relist them. We found here in our data sets that you have the same effect. The number of livestock depredations the following year are the same if you harvest wolves at 3% or 40%. The decision is yours. you want to reduce livestock depredations and federally relist wolves and shoot them at 40% per year? Or do you want to kill those selected depredating individuals at about 3% per year and get the same result? Very few livestock depredations. And that's a philosophical position that states and wildlife agencies will have to take. Interestingly, the worst rate of livestock depredations seems to be at about 25%. That's a standing wave of high livestock depredations. And if I'm correct, we've been harvesting wolves at that rate in a number of states for a number of years, and it coincided with the highest rates of livestock depredations, creating a standing wave. The putative solution is the cause of the problem. Obviously, further research is needed to get at exact causal mechanisms. Other things are, is this same thing happening with natural prey? I know people are concerned about wolf effects on natural prey. Let's look at the data for once, like we did here. I can't quite understand why no one looked at this data in the first place. It's available for years. We just had to get it from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and analyze it. But let's take the scientific approach and see, what the effects of anthropogenic mortality on wolves are. Is it compensatory? Do you get reduced losses of natural prey? Or do you get the same losses of natural prey? Or do you get even increased losses? We don't know yet. Hopefully we can look at that down in the future. Also, I want to look at the scale and reconcile the possible effects on small scales versus large scales. Again, that's the exact causal mechanism of these interesting patterns that we're finding. Now again, I just want to reiterate, this was not funded by by state legislative appropriated funds. This is funded by Washington State University and the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife because we're looking at lethal control. There are certain organizations that didn't want us to examine the effects of lethal control, perhaps anticipating these types of results. Special thanks to all those who reviewed this. I just want to reiterate, the authors of this paper, this is in press, right? It's coming out this month in PLOS One. And it's not just Kaylee Peebles and I. The data are freely available. They'll be published in PLOS One, so anyone can analyze those raw data. It has been peer-reviewed by 2 independent university statisticians who do not want to be named because they fear that this may negatively impact their careers or personal lives. It has been extensively peer-reviewed by all the wolf biologists for the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks, Idaho Fish and Game, Wyoming Department, Fish and Game, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, 2 anonymous reviewers, and the associate and full editor of PLOS One. So this paper has gone through the most review I have ever done. We've gone through this over and over and over by dozens of people 100 times because we know that the results are extremely controversial. Despite all that super extensive peer review, no one has been able to come up with a reason to say something was done wrong. That the data is the data, right? These are the raw data. These are our results. We analyze them correctly, and we're simply reporting them. A lot of people are not going to like these results. And what are you going to do? Sorry, the Earth ain't flat after all. It's round. Anyway, I want a special thanks to Hillary Cooley, John Pierce, Donnie Martorell, all the folks in WDFW who work with me closely on this. Some of them may wish that they hadn't, but these things happen, right? What are you going to do? Okay, the data's the data. Hey, I'm sorry. But look forward to this coming out, and as the editor of PLOS One said, Rob, this paper's going to go. Good thing I have tenure, I suppose, huh? I think my time's up. I'm going to leave it to the next one.